Nobody believed in broken dreams until mine became the most watched story of the year. My name is Marcus, and 36 years ago, I was born into a world that seemed determined to prove I didn't belong. But this isn't just another sob story about a man who fell from grace. This is about how the deepest wounds can become the most powerful testimonies, and how sometimes the people who write you off completely are the ones who end up watching your triumph on the biggest screens in America. It started on a Tuesday morning in downtown Phoenix, Arizona. I was sitting on a cracked plastic chair in the unemployment office, holding a rejection letter that felt heavier than concrete in my trembling hands. 43 job applications in 2 months. 43 no thank you responses. At 36, I felt like I was staring into an abyss that had no bottom. The woman behind the counter looked at me with that familiar expression I'd grown to hate. A mixture of pity and impatience that said, "Here's another lost cause taking up space." Her name tag read Sandra, and Sandra clearly had better things to do than deal with me. "Mr. Thompson," she said, barely looking up from her computer screen, "your unemployment benefits are running out next month. Have you considered adjusting your expectations?" Adjusting my expectations. Those 3 words hit me like a punch to the gut. I had been a documentary filmmaker once. Not a famous one, but I had passion, vision, and more importantly, I had stories to tell. Stories about real people, real struggles, real triumphs. But the industry had chewed me up and spit me out like so many others before me. "I used to make documentaries," I whispered, more to myself than to her. Sandra finally looked up, and I saw something flicker in her eyes. Not sympathy, but something worse. Amusement. "Documentaries," she repeated, and I heard the skepticism dripping from her voice. "Well, maybe it's time to think about something more realistic. McDonald's is hiring, so is the warehouse district." The people in line behind me were getting restless. I could feel their eyes on my back, their silent judgment. Here was this guy holding up the line, probably another dreamer who couldn't face reality. Another middle-aged man who couldn't accept that his artistic phase was over. I left that office feeling smaller than I had in years. But as I walked to my beat-up Honda Civic in the parking lot, something Sandra had said kept echoing in my mind. Not the part about McDonald's. That stung, but I'd heard worse. It was the way she'd said documentaries, like it was some kind of joke, some impossible fantasy that men like me shouldn't even dare to whisper. That night, in my studio apartment that smelled like instant ramen and broken dreams, I sat on my second-hand couch and stared at the stack of rejection letters on my coffee table. Film festivals, production companies, streaming services, they all had the same message. "Thank you for your submission, but your project doesn't align with our current vision." My current project, the one I'd been working on for 3 years. The one that had cost me my savings, my relationship with Sarah, and apparently my sanity according to most people who knew me. It was a documentary about homeless veterans in Phoenix, specifically focusing on how the system failed them after they'd served their country. I'd spent countless nights on the streets with a handheld camera, building trust with men and women who'd been forgotten by everyone else. Their stories were raw, heartbreaking, and absolutely real. But apparently, raw and heartbreaking wasn't what the industry wanted. They wanted polished, marketable, safe content that wouldn't make viewers uncomfortable during their dinner. The worst part wasn't the rejection from strangers. It was watching my own family slowly lose faith in me. My brother David, who worked in corporate finance, had stopped asking about my little film projects months ago. During our last conversation, he'd suggested I look into getting my real estate license. "Marcus, you're 36 years old," he'd said over coffee, using that tone people reserve for explaining basic concepts to children. "This documentary thing, it's not working out. Maybe it's time to grow up and get a real job." A real job. As if telling the stories of forgotten people wasn't real work. As if spending 3 years documenting the struggles of American heroes wasn't worth something. as if the thousands of hours I'd invested in learning their names, their stories, their pain, was just some kind of expensive hobby. My ex-girlfriend Sarah had been even more direct. "You're obsessed with these people, Marcus," she'd said during our final argument. "You care more about your homeless friends than you do about building an actual life with me." She wasn't entirely wrong. I did care about them. I cared about Tommy, the Vietnam vet who slept behind the Circle K and painted landscapes on cardboard scraps. I cared about Maria, the former army medic who'd lost everything after a PTSD episode cost her a job in civilian healthcare. I cared about their stories because nobody else did. But caring doesn't pay rent. Caring doesn't stop bill collectors from calling. Caring doesn't prevent the woman you love from walking out because she's tired of dating a lost cause. That's what Sarah had called me in the end, a lost cause. The words stung because part of me was starting to believe them. Sometimes you have to lose everything to discover what you're really made of. The eviction notice came on a Thursday. Pink paper, bold letters, 30 days to vacate. I stared at it for a full minute before the reality hit me like a freight train. This was it. This was how my story ended. Not with acclaim or recognition, but with a pink slip of paper that declared me officially homeless. I called my brother David, swallowing what little pride I had left. "I need help," I said when he answered, my voice barely above a whisper. There was a long pause. I could hear his kids playing in the background, the sound of a normal family living a normal life. Everything I'd given up chasing an impossible dream. "Marcus," he said finally, and I could hear the exhaustion in his voice. "How much do you need this time? This time?" Like I was some kind of chronic beggar who'd been bleeding him dry for years. The truth was I'd never asked him for money before, not once. But apparently, in his mind, I was already the failure who couldn't take care of himself. "I'm getting evicted," I said. "I just need enough for—" "Jesus Christ, Marcus." I heard him sigh heavily. "I can't keep enabling this fantasy of yours. You're 36 years old, living like a college kid, chasing some ridiculous dream that's never going to happen." "It's not a fantasy, David. These stories matter. These people aren't your responsibility." His voice rose, and I heard him walk into another room, probably so his wife and kids wouldn't hear him yelling at his loser brother. "You know what your responsibility is? Getting your life together, finding a real job, acting like an adult." The line went quiet, except for the sound of my heart pounding in my ears. "I can give you money for a security deposit on a cheaper place," he said finally. "But only if you promise me you'll stop this documentary nonsense and start looking for real work." I hung up without saying goodbye. That night, I sat in my empty apartment. They'd already repossessed most of my furniture, and looked at the final cut of my documentary on my laptop screen. 3 years of work. Hundreds of hours of footage, stories that deserved to be told, voices that deserved to be heard, and nobody wanted it. I'd submitted it to 17 film festivals, 17 rejections. The feedback was always the same. Compelling subject matter, but the execution lacks the polish we're looking for. Translation: this looks like it was made by an amateur with no budget, because it was. The final insult came the next morning. I'd applied for a position at a local news station, not as a filmmaker, just as a production assistant. Minimum wage, entry-level work that I was apparently overqualified for and underqualified for at the same time. The interview was with Janet Morrison, the station manager. She was probably my age, wearing a power suit that cost more than my rent, sitting behind a desk that screamed success, everything I wasn't. "So, Marcus," she said, glancing at my resume with barely concealed disdain, "it says here you've been unemployed for 8 months? I've been working on an independent documentary project," I explained, trying to inject some confidence into my voice. She looked up at me with that expression I'd grown to recognize, the look that said, "Here's another delusional artist who thinks his hobby qualifies as work." "Right," she said, drawing out the word. "And this documentary, has it been picked up by anyone? Any distribution deals, festival acceptances?" My silence was answer enough. "Listen, Marcus," she continued, leaning back in her chair, "we're looking for someone who's serious about a career in media, someone reliable, someone who isn't going to disappear the moment they think they've got their next big break." She paused, studying my face like she was trying to solve a puzzle. "Can I give you some advice, man to man?" She wasn't waiting for my answer. "This documentary thing you're doing, it's not working. You're 36, you're broke, and you're about to be homeless. Maybe it's time to ask yourself if you're chasing a dream or running from reality." I left that interview feeling like I'd been stripped naked and paraded through the town square. On the drive home, soon to be my former home, I stopped at a red light and caught sight of myself in the rearview mirror. When had I started looking so defeated? When had my eyes lost that spark that used to drive me to stay up all night editing footage? That evening, Tommy found me sitting on a bench outside the Circle K, where he usually slept. He was carrying his latest cardboard painting, a sunset over the desert that was so beautiful it made my chest ache. "You look like hell, film guy," he said, settling down beside me. I laughed, but there was no humor in it. "I feel like hell, Tommy." What happened?" I told him everything. The eviction, the phone call with my brother, the humiliating interview. I told him how everyone in my life thought I was delusional, how maybe they were right, how maybe I should just give up and get a job at McDonald's like Sandra had suggested. Tommy listened without saying a word. When I finished, he held up his painting. "You know why I paint these?" he asked. I shook my head. "Because somebody needs to see what I see. This desert, this sky, most people drive past it every day and never really look. They think it's just empty space between point A and point B. But it's not. It's beautiful, and it's worth capturing, and it's worth sharing." He looked at me with eyes that had seen too much, but somehow still held hope. "Your documentary about us, that's not just a film, Marcus. That's proof we existed. That's proof our stories mattered to someone. Don't you dare let those suits convince you that what you're doing isn't important." But as I sat there listening to Tommy's words, all I could think about was the pink eviction notice in my pocket and the empty bank account that meant I'd probably be sleeping on this very bench within a month. Everyone was right. I was a lost cause. What I didn't know was that sometimes being a lost cause is exactly what the world needs to see. Rock bottom became the solid foundation on which I built my comeback. 3 weeks later, I was officially homeless. Not the romantic, choosing to live simply kind of homeless that people write books about. The real kind. The kind where you shower at the YMCA and sleep in your car, praying it doesn't break down because you can't afford to fix it. I'd been sleeping behind the same Circle K where Tommy painted his sunsets. It felt appropriate somehow, the failed filmmaker bunking with the subjects of his failed film. At least, Tommy had gotten used to my company, and Maria would sometimes share her dinner with me when the local church group made their rounds. "You still got that camera?" Maria asked one evening as we sat around a small fire Tommy had built in a metal trash can. I patted the backpack that contained my entire life now, a change of clothes, some toiletries, and my camera equipment. "Yeah, but what's the point?" "The point," said a voice behind me, "is that you never know who might be watching." I turned around to see a woman in her 50s, well-dressed but not intimidating, holding a cup of coffee and studying our little group with intelligent eyes. She wasn't from the usual church volunteers or social workers who sometimes visited. There was something different about her, something that made Tommy straighten up and Maria instinctively smooth her hair. "I'm sorry," the woman said, approaching slowly with her hands visible, the universal sign of someone who understood that homeless people had every reason to be cautious of strangers. "I don't mean to intrude. I'm Dr. Sarah Chen. I work for the Phoenix Department of Veterans Affairs." Tommy laughed bitterly. "Another government worker here to count us and forget us." But Dr. Chen didn't flinch. "Actually, I'm here because of him." She pointed directly at me. "You're Marcus Thompson, aren't you? The man who's been making a documentary about veteran homelessness." My heart stopped. How did she know about my documentary? I hadn't told anyone in the VA about it. I'd learned early on that government workers didn't appreciate freelance filmmakers poking around their failures. Yes, that's me, I stammered. But how did you... Tommy mentioned you to one of our outreach workers last month, she said, settling down on an empty milk crate like she belonged there. He said there was this filmmaker who actually listened to their stories, who treated them like human beings instead of statistics. Tommy looked embarrassed. I might have said something. Dr. Chen turned her full attention to me. I've been trying to get funding for a comprehensive study on veteran homelessness for 2 years. The bureaucrats want numbers and charts, but they don't want to hear the real stories. They don't want to face the human cost of their failed policies. She paused, studying my face in the firelight. Tommy says you have hours of footage, real interviews with real veterans. Is that true? I nodded, not trusting my voice. Can I see it? That night, in the 24-hour diner where Dr. Chen had insisted on buying me dinner, I showed her my documentary on my laptop. She watched in complete silence for 43 minutes, the entire rough cut I'd been shopping around to festivals and distributors. When it ended, she sat back and looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen in months. Respect. This is extraordinary, she said quietly. This is exactly what Congress needs to see. Congress? I nearly choked on my coffee. There's a hearing next month about veteran services funding. Senator Patricia Williams is chairing the committee. She's been asking for real evidence of how the current system is failing our veterans. Dr. Chen leaned forward, her eyes bright with possibility. This documentary, this could change everything. I felt something I hadn't felt in so long I'd forgotten what it was like, hope. But it's not polished, I said, my old insecurities creeping back in. It doesn't have the production value that... Marcus, Dr. Chen interrupted. Do you know what's wrong with most documentaries about homelessness? They're made by people who've never been homeless. They're filmed from the outside looking in, with fancy cameras and professional lighting that makes everything look like a movie set. She gestured toward my laptop screen. This was filmed by someone who understands what it means to be forgotten, someone who earned their trust because you didn't just interview them, you lived among them. You didn't just document their struggle, you shared it. The next morning, Dr. Chen introduced me to her supervisor, then his supervisor, then theirs. Within a week, I was sitting in a conference room at the VA headquarters, watching government officials view my documentary with the kind of attention I'd dreamed of from film festival programmers. But the real validation came from an unexpected source. Mr. Thompson, said Director James Walsh, the head of the Phoenix VA after the screening ended. I have to ask, how did you get veterans to open up like this? We've been trying to conduct interviews for our own internal reviews, and most of them won't even talk to our staff. I thought about Tommy teaching me which dumpsters had the best food, about Maria showing me how to stay warm on cold nights, about the dozen other veterans who'd welcomed me into their world when the rest of society had rejected me. I think, I said carefully, they talked to me because I wasn't trying to fix them, or study them, or turn them into a report. I was just trying to survive, same as them. Director Walsh nodded slowly. That authenticity comes through in every frame. This isn't just a documentary, Mr. Thompson. This is testimony. 2 days later, I got a call that changed everything. Senator Williams herself wanted to screen the documentary for the full committee before the hearing. But more than that, she wanted me to testify alongside it. You mean speak to Congress? I asked Dr. Chen, certain I'd misunderstood. I mean, tell them what you told me. Tell them what Tommy and Maria and all the others told you. Be their voice in that chamber. That night, I called my brother David for the first time since he'd refused to help me avoid eviction. Marcus, he sounded surprised to hear from me. Are you okay? I heard things got bad. They did get bad, I said. But David, something incredible is happening. I told him about Dr. Chen, about the VA, about the congressional hearing. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. You're serious? He said finally. They want to show your documentary to Congress. Not just show it, I said, feeling that unfamiliar sensation of pride creeping into my chest. They want me to testify about what I witnessed, about what these veterans go through. Another pause. Jesus, Marcus, I owe you an apology. But I wasn't angry anymore. How could I be? Without hitting rock bottom, without losing everything, without becoming homeless myself, I never would have earned the trust that made my documentary authentic. I never would have understood their stories from the inside. Sometimes you have to become a lost cause to find your true cause. When they finally listened, the whole world heard. The Hart Senate office building felt like a cathedral of power. Marble floors, towering columns, and the kind of hushed atmosphere that makes you whisper even when there's no reason to be quiet. 3 months ago, I'd been sleeping behind a Circle K. Now I was walking through the halls of Congress, carrying a briefcase that contained the stories everyone had dismissed as worthless. Senator Patricia Williams was nothing like I'd expected. She was in her early 60s, with silver hair and sharp eyes that seemed to see right through political nonsense. When she shook my hand before the hearing, she looked me directly in the eye. "Mr. Thompson," she said, "I've watched your documentary 3 times. I need you to know, what you've captured isn't just filmmaking. It's evidence of a system that's failing the very people it's supposed to serve." The hearing room was packed. Cameras from C-SPAN, reporters from major networks, and government officials who'd probably never given veteran homelessness a second thought until today. In the front row, I spotted Dr. Chen giving me an encouraging nod. And there, in the back corner, was something that nearly brought me to tears. Tommy, Maria, and 6 other veterans from my documentary, all dressed in their cleanest clothes, all there to watch their stories finally be heard. The committee chairman called the session to order, and my documentary began playing on the large screens positioned around the room. For 43 minutes, the most powerful legislative body in America watched the stories that every film festival had rejected, every distributor had ignored, every person in my life had called a waste of time. But this time, something was different. This time, people were listening. When Tommy appeared on screen, talking about his nightmares and his paintings, I saw Senator Williams lean forward. When Maria described losing her job because of PTSD, another senator actually took notes. When Vietnam veteran Robert Johnson talked about sleeping in his car for 2 years, despite having served his country with honor, the room was so quiet you could hear the air conditioning humming. Then came my turn to testify. "Senators," I began, my voice steadier than I'd expected. 6 months ago, I was exactly where these veterans are now, homeless, forgotten, written off by everyone, including my own family, as a lost cause. I looked directly at the cameras, knowing that somewhere, Sandra from the unemployment office might be watching. Somewhere, Janet Morrison from the news station might be seeing this. Somewhere, everyone who'd told me to give up and get a real job might be tuning in. But here's what I learned living on those streets. When society throws you away, you discover what really matters. These veterans didn't choose homelessness. They didn't choose PTSD. They didn't choose to be abandoned by a system they served faithfully. What they chose was to survive, with dignity, despite being invisible to the rest of us. Senator Williams interrupted me. "Mr. Thompson, what would you say to critics who might argue that your documentary is biased because of your personal situation?" I had been prepared for this question, but not for how it would make me feel. "Senator, every documentary is biased. The question is whether that bias serves truth or serves comfort. Most films about homelessness are made by people who get to go home to warm beds afterward. They can afford to make it pretty, to find the inspirational angle, to give viewers the hope that makes them feel better about not actually doing anything." I paused, thinking about all those polished documentaries that had been accepted to festivals while mine was rejected. My bias is different. My bias is that I know what it feels like to be invisible. I know what it means when people cross the street to avoid making eye contact with you. I know the shame of being hungry and the fear of not knowing where you'll sleep. That bias didn't make my documentary less truthful. It made it more truthful than anything filmed from the outside, looking in. The room was dead silent. These veterans' stories matter because they're real, not because they're inspiring or uplifting or because they have happy endings. They matter because these are American heroes who served their country and came home to find that their country had forgotten them. If we can't face that truth, then we don't deserve their service. When I finished speaking, something unprecedented happened. The gallery, filled with government officials, reporters and lobbyists who'd seen thousands of testimonies, began to applaud. Not the polite obligatory clapping you'd expect, but real applause that lasted nearly a minute. 3 weeks later, Senator Williams called me personally. "Marcus," she said, "I wanted to be the first to tell you. The committee voted unanimously to increase veteran homelessness funding by 300%. We're calling it the Invisible Heroes Act. But that wasn't the end of it. That was just the beginning. Within days of the C-SPAN footage going viral, my phone started ringing. First it was PBS, wanting to broadcast the documentary nationwide. Then Netflix called, interested in distribution rights. Then the Sundance Film Festival, the same festival that had rejected my submission 8 months earlier, reached out asking if I'd consider entering their next year's competition. The most surreal call came from Janet Morrison, the news station manager who'd humiliated me during that job interview. "Marcus," she said, and I could hear the awkwardness in her voice, "I wanted to reach out about a possible opportunity. We'd love to discuss having you create a documentary series for our station about local social issues." I let the silence hang for a moment before responding. "Janet, I appreciate the call, but I'm going to have to pass. You see, I'm busy working on something real, something that matters, something that might not align with your current vision." I hung up feeling something I'd never experienced before. The quiet satisfaction of knowing my worth. The documentary that no one wanted became the most watched PBS special of the year. It won 3 Emmy Awards, including Best Documentary Feature. But more importantly, it led to real change. The Invisible Heroes Act passed Congress with bipartisan support, providing funding and services that would help thousands of veterans find housing and support. Tommy never had to sleep behind the Circle K again. Maria got the mental health treatment she needed and eventually found work at the VA, helping other veterans navigate the system. Robert Johnson got his apartment and now volunteers at a veteran resource center 3 days a week. And me, I learned that sometimes the stories the world doesn't want to hear are exactly the stories the world needs to hear most. Everyone had called me a lost cause. Turns out, lost causes make the best storytellers. Success tastes different when you've earned it through suffering. The Emmy statue felt heavier than I'd expected. Standing on that stage at the Microsoft Theater in Los Angeles, holding the Golden Award that represented everything I'd dreamed of for 15 years, I couldn't help but think about the plastic chair in the unemployment office where Sandra had suggested I lower my expectations. "This award," I said into the microphone, my voice carrying across a theater filled with Hollywood's elite, "belongs to every veteran who shared their story with me. To Tommy, who taught me that art exists even in the darkest places. To Maria, who showed me that strength isn't about never falling down, it's about getting back up. And to every person who's been told they're a lost cause. Sometimes being lost is exactly where you need to be to find your way." The standing ovation lasted 3 minutes. 3 minutes of applause from the same industry that had rejected me, ignored me, and written me off as amateur. But as I stood there, bathed in spotlight and success, all I could think about was the journey that had led me here. The months following the congressional hearing had been a whirlwind. Invisible Heroes, the title PBS had given my documentary, became a cultural phenomenon. It sparked national conversations about veteran care, homelessness, and how we treat society's most vulnerable members. Suddenly, everyone wanted to know the story behind the story. The interview requests came flooding in. 60 Minutes, The Tonight Show, NPR's Fresh Air. Every major media outlet wanted to talk to the filmmaker who'd gone from homeless to Emmy winner in less than a year. But the interview that mattered most to me was the one I gave to a small Phoenix news station, Janet Morrison's station. The irony wasn't lost on me. Janet, who had once suggested I wasn't serious enough for a minimum wage production assistant job, was now interviewing me as her station's lead story on the evening news. "Marcus," she said, her professional smile not quite hiding her discomfort. "Looking back on your journey, what would you say to people who might have underestimated your potential?" I looked directly into the camera, knowing that Sandra from the unemployment office might be watching, that my brother David would definitely be watching, that everyone who dismissed my dreams would see this. "I'd say that sometimes the people who count you out are doing you a favor," I replied. "When everyone stops believing in you, you're finally free to discover what you're truly capable of." After the interview, Janet walked me to the parking lot. The same parking lot where I'd sat in my beat-up Honda after she'd humiliated me, wondering if everyone was right about me being delusional. "Marcus," she said, stopping beside my new car. "Nothing fancy, but reliable and paid for with honest work. I owe you an apology. What I said during that interview, it was unprofessional. I was wrong about you." I studied her face, remembering how small she'd made me feel that day. How she'd looked at me like I was a child who needed to be taught about reality. "You weren't wrong about my situation," I said finally. "I was broke, unemployed, and about to be homeless. Those were facts. Where you were wrong was thinking that those facts defined my worth." The real validation, though, came from unexpected places. 3 weeks after the Emmy win, I got a call from my old film school professor, Dr. Richard Hayes. 20 years earlier, he'd told me I had potential but lacked focus. Now he was calling to offer me a position as a guest lecturer at USC's School of Cinematic Arts. "We want our students to learn from someone who's experienced real storytelling," he said. "Someone who understands that the most powerful films come from authentic experience, not just technical skill." Standing in front of a classroom full of eager film students, many of them from privileged backgrounds who'd never known real hardship, I shared a truth that no textbook could teach them. "The best stories aren't found in comfortable places," I told them. "They're found in the spaces where polite society doesn't want to look. If you want to make films that matter, you have to be willing to go where it's uncomfortable. You have to be willing to fail, to be rejected, to be called crazy." One student raised her hand. "But what if everyone tells you your project isn't good enough? What if all the festivals reject you?" I smiled, thinking about my stack of rejection letters, about Sandra's dismissive laugh, about my brother's exhausted sighs. "Then you keep going anyway," I said, "because sometimes the projects that get rejected are the ones the world needs most. Sometimes being told no is just the universe's way of making sure you're serious about your yes." But perhaps the most meaningful recognition came from the veterans themselves. 6 months after the Emmy ceremony, the Phoenix VA opened a new resource center for homeless veterans. They asked me to speak at the dedication ceremony, and there, in the front row, sat all the men and women whose stories had changed everything. Tommy had brought one of his paintings, a landscape of the desert at sunrise, full of hope and possibility. He presented it to me after my speech. "This is for you, film guy," he said, his eyes bright with tears. "You didn't just tell our stories. You made people see us as human beings again." Maria, now working as a peer counselor at the center, hugged me afterward. "You know what the best part is?" she said. "Kids who come through here now, they have hope. They see what happened to us, and they know their stories matter too." That night, I called my brother David. Our relationship had been slowly healing since the congressional hearing, but there was still something I needed to say. "David," I said when he answered, "I want you to know something. When you refused to help me with rent that day, when you told me to give up on my documentary, that was exactly what I needed to hear." "What do you mean?" he asked, confusion clear in his voice. I mean that if you'd enabled me to stay comfortable, if you'd given me just enough money to avoid rock bottom, I never would have ended up on those streets. I never would have gained the trust of those veterans. I never would have made the film that changed everything. There was a long pause. So you're saying my rejection helped you succeed? I'm saying that sometimes the people who refuse to catch you when you're falling are the ones who force you to learn how to fly. The documentary that everyone called impossible had aired in over 40 countries. It had been translated into 12 languages. Most importantly, it had led to policy changes that helped thousands of veterans find housing and support. Everyone had been wrong about me. Everyone except the people whose stories I'd chosen to tell. Sometimes, the best way to prove you're not a lost cause is to become the voice for other lost causes. 2 years later, I stood in that same unemployment office in Phoenix where it all began. But this time I wasn't there as a desperate job seeker. I was there filming my follow-up documentary about how government systems can either break people or rebuild them. Sandra was still working behind the same counter. She recognized me immediately, her eyes widening as she processed who I was. "Mr. Thompson," she said, her voice uncertain. I saw you on the news. Congratulations on your success." I looked at her. This woman who had once suggested I adjust my expectations and consider McDonald's as a career option. And I felt something unexpected. Gratitude. "Sandra," I said, "I want to thank you." She looked confused. "Thank me? For treating me exactly the way you did that day, for showing me what it feels like to be written off. Without that experience, I never would have understood what the veterans in my documentary go through every single day." I paused, watching her process my words. "You taught me that sometimes the most valuable thing someone can do is refuse to enable your comfort zone. Sometimes getting knocked down is the only way to discover you can get back up." As I left that office for the second time, I thought about the journey from that first visit to this moment. From broken dreams to Emmy winner, from lost cause to voice for the voiceless, from invisible to impossible to ignore. The rejected documentary that no one wanted to see became the most important film of my career. The homeless filmmaker became a congressional witness. The lost cause became a beacon of hope for other lost causes everywhere. Sometimes you have to lose everything to find out what you're really made of. Sometimes you have to become invisible to finally be seen. And sometimes the people who tell you to give up are actually giving you the greatest gift of all, the chance to prove them wrong. My name is Marcus Thompson. They called me a lost cause until my story became an award-winning documentary. But the real award wasn't the Emmy sitting on my shelf. The real award was learning that every rejection, every humiliation, every moment of doubt was just preparation for the moment when my voice would finally matter. The world told me I was broken. Turns out, broken people know how to fix things that really matter, and that's a story worth telling.
If this story touched your heart and made you think, don't forget to give this video a like and subscribe to the channel for more inspiring stories like this one. Share this video with someone who needs to hear that miracles can happen when we least expect them. What do you think about what happened to our protagonist? Leave us a comment below telling us if you've ever experienced a similar situation or what you thought of this incredible story. Your support helps us continue bringing these stories that remind us that life can always surprise us. See you in the next video.